In the middle years of the 13th century, the world from the Yellow Sea to the Mediterranean lived under a single, shared assumption. The Mongols did not lose. They might withdraw, they might pause, they might turn aside for reasons no one fully understood, but when they committed themselves to conquest, resistance ended in ruin. Cities vanished, dynasties collapsed, armies that had taken centuries to build dissolved in hours. By 1260, this was not rumor or exaggeration. It was a pattern, repeated so often that it had begun to feel like a law of nature. 2 years earlier, that sense of inevitability had reached its darkest confirmation. Baghdad, the symbolic and intellectual center of the Islamic world, had fallen to the armies of Hulagu Khan. Its caliph was killed, its libraries destroyed, its population slaughtered. News of the catastrophe traveled west faster than refugees, faster than merchants, faster than official dispatches. What mattered was not the detail, but the conclusion everyone drew from it. If Baghdad could fall, nothing sacred remained. Egypt, with its wealth, grain, and strategic position at the hinge of Africa and Asia, was next. Yet the Mongol war machine that now looked southward was not as unified as it appeared. The death of the great Khan Monka had pulled Hulagu east with much of his army, leaving behind a smaller force in Syria under the command of Kitbuka. It was still a formidable army by any conventional measure, but for the first time in a generation, the Mongols were not advancing with overwhelming weight. They were holding ground, issuing threats, expecting submission to follow fear, as it always had. Facing them was a state unlike any the Mongols had previously confronted. The Mamluk Sultanate was not an old dynasty defending tradition or territory. It was a regime built almost entirely around military competence. Its rulers were former slave soldiers, men trained from youth for war, hardened by internal coups, border fighting, and constant readiness. They knew steppe warfare. Many of them had been born on its fringes. They understood feigned retreats, mounted archery, and the discipline required to execute complex maneuvers under pressure. The confrontation that followed would take place not at the walls of a great city, but in a narrow valley in Palestine called Ain Jalut. There, for the first time, the Mongols would be met by an enemy that did not panic, did not break formation, and did not mistake inevitability for destiny. What happened in that valley would not end the Mongol Empire, but it would end the belief that it could not be stopped. Baghdad had not fallen because the city lacked courage. Baghdad fell because the Mongols had turned conquest into a method, patient, technical, and psychologically ruthless. On the eastern bank of the Tigris in early 1258, Hulagu's army did not arrive as a storm. It arrived as a machine. Engineers measured distances, sappers tunneled, catapults were assembled like certainty made of timber and rope. The Mongols did not merely attack walls, they removed the idea that walls mattered. Inside the city, the Abbasid court argued about pride and precedent while the ring tightened. Outside, the Mongols made a point of bringing everyone who needed to see the point. Allied contingents, subject princes, local notables, summoned to witness what happens to a world that mistakes memory for defense. When the breach came, it came with the cold logic of an example. Baghdad was not just taken. Baghdad was demonstrated. The shock was not confined to the Islamic world. In the Levant, the Crusader states watched the Mongol advance with a calculation that turned uneasy by the month. In Armenia, and among some Christian communities under Muslim rule, there were those who hoped the Mongols might be a new patron, a new balance, a chance to survive between larger powers. In Damascus, Aleppo, and the towns in between, people learned a grim new grammar: submit early and live under a conqueror, resist and gamble your city against an enemy that keeps careful accounts. After Baghdad, Syria began to look like a corridor rather than a frontier. Aleppo fell in 1260. Damascus opened its gates soon after. The Mongol presence in the region felt like the first breath of a larger suffocation. Officials stayed at their posts because someone had to keep the markets open. Clerics preached endurance because someone had to keep people from fleeing into the hills. Fathers married off daughters quickly because war changes what later means. In those same months, the Mongol Empire also began to feel something it had rarely had to endure: its own scale. The empire had been built by rapid movement, by shock, by sudden concentration of force where no one expected it. But the empire was now so vast that news itself became a kind of terrain. The death of the great Khan Monka did not simply announce mourning. It announced a succession struggle, and succession struggles in a steppe empire were not paperwork. They were war by other means, and they demanded the presence of princes and armies. Hulagu was in the west because the Mongol imperial family had decided the caliphate in Baghdad was an obstacle that could not be tolerated. He had done that work thoroughly. Now a messenger arrived with the kind of news that changes maps. Monke was dead. The center pulled on the periphery like gravity. Hulagu could not ignore that pull, not without risking his own position and the legitimacy of everything he had just conquered. So Hulagu made a decision that would echo all the way to a valley in Palestine. He withdrew the bulk of his army east toward Azerbaijan and beyond to secure his place in the coming imperial contest. He left behind a force in Syria that was large enough to police submission and punish rebellion, but not large enough to crush a fully mobilized rival state, if that rival chose to fight on its own terms. The man left in charge of that forward position was Kitbuka, a Mongol commander with a reputation for stubbornness and personal bravery. Kitbuka had survived campaigns that had broken other men. He had watched fortresses fall and armies scatter. He had every reason to believe that Syria would hold, that fear would do the work that numbers no longer could, and that Egypt, like everyone else, would make the rational choice. In Damascus, Mongol authority settled into the routines of occupation. The city had been spared the worst kind of destruction, but it was not free. Mongol officials collected tribute. Local leaders pledged obedience with careful faces. Syrian troops were drafted into auxiliary service. Rumors moved faster than orders. A rumor of a new Mongol advance, a rumor of a Mongol retreat, a rumor that Egypt was already negotiating submission, a rumor that Egypt had decided to fight and was marching north. Kitbuka did not wait for rumors to become reality. He sent envoys to Cairo with a letter that was not diplomacy in the usual sense. Mongol letters of submission were instruments of psychological war. They spoke in the language of inevitability. They offered mercy as a reward for obedience and promised annihilation as a consequence of delay. They were written to make choice feel like illusion. The letter's real audience was not only the Sultan in Cairo. It was every emir listening in the audience hall, every soldier on the city walls, every merchant wondering whether to hoard grain or sell it. It was meant to turn a government into a whispering room, to make resistance look like madness. Cairo in 1260 was not a calm place, even before the Mongols came into focus. The city was the heart of a state that had been born in coup and maintained by military skill. The Mamluks were not a single family with a crown passed from father to son. They were factions of elite soldiers, many of them purchased as boys from the steppe regions north of the Black Sea, trained relentlessly, then freed into a brotherhood that was as much political as it was martial. Loyalty was personal, power was negotiated, stability was something you fought for every day. The Mongol threat did not arrive at a moment of unity. It arrived at a moment when unity had to be forced. The man who would force it was Kutuz. He had come to the throne not through inheritance but through necessity and violence, pushing aside a young and weak sultan in order to put an adult commander in control. Kutuz was not romantic, he was practical, and practicality in 1260 meant one thing. If Cairo waited for the Mongols to arrive on the Nile, Cairo would face them at the walls with a terrified population behind and nowhere to retreat. If Cairo wanted a chance, Cairo had to meet the Mongols before the desert ended and the river began. In Kutuz's court, another name carried weight: Baybars. Baybars was younger, sharper, already famous for fighting the Crusaders years earlier. He was ambitious, and everyone in the room knew it. That knowledge did not make him useless. It made him dangerous in the way useful men are dangerous. Kutuz needed Baybars's talent, and Baybars needed Kutuz's throne, if not now, then soon. When Kitbuka's envoys arrived, they did not enter a naive court. They entered a court that knew exactly what Mongol submission meant. Everyone in Cairo had heard what happened in Baghdad. Everyone had heard what happened to princes who tried to bargain after delaying. Everyone understood that the Mongols did not simply want tribute, they wanted submission of will. They wanted the acknowledgement that a new order had arrived and that resistance was not only futile but wrong. Kutuz let the envoys speak. He let the letter be read. And then he made a decision designed to burn away hesitation. The envoys were executed. In many cultures, envoys are protected because diplomacy is considered sacred. In Mongol culture, envoys were protected because they were instruments of empire. Harming them was treated as a declaration of war and a confession of defiance. Kutuz's decision was not an emotional outburst. It was a political act meant to close the door behind him. Once the envoys were dead, there could be no secret negotiation, no quiet surrender, no faction in Cairo arguing for submission without arguing against the reality on the walls. Cairo had chosen war. The severed heads were displayed as a public message. The message was not primarily for the Mongols, it was for Cairo itself. It said, "The arguments are over. The doubt is finished. The only question left is whether the army can do what the government has now forced it to do." War, however, is not willed into existence by bravado. It is built by logistics. In the weeks that followed, Cairo became a city of preparation. Horses were gathered, weapons were inspected, grain was requisitioned. Emirs were compelled to cooperate because failure would mean not simply defeat, but annihilation. If the Mongols reached the Nile's fertility would become a prize, and Cairo's crowded streets would become a killing ground. Kutuz moved quickly. He summoned forces from across Egypt. Baybars was given command responsibilities that matched his talent, and promises were made about rewards in Syria, promises that sounded generous in Cairo and would become dangerously specific once Syria was actually taken. By late summer 1260, the Mamluk army began to move north. The route itself was a test. Marching an army from Cairo to Palestine meant crossing the Sinai, hard country that punishes delay and rewards discipline. Water had to be managed like ammunition. Horses had to be protected like a treasury. Men had to be kept focused when the horizon looked empty and the threat looked distant. The Mamluks had one advantage that mattered more than courage. They were accustomed to being managed. Their entire social system was built around training, command, and obedience. The Mongols' reputation could frighten any army. The Mamluks' structure could keep frightened men in formation. As the army pushed through the desert, scouts ranged ahead. News came back in fragments. Mongol garrisons in Gaza, Mongol patrols near the roads, Mongol allies among local tribes, Mongol administrators collecting taxes in towns that had once sworn loyalty to Cairo. Each fragment was a reminder that the Mongols were not only an army, they were an occupation. An occupation means that your enemy is already inside the places you intend to save. Near Gaza, Baybars led the forward elements of the Mamluk force into contact. The clash was not the main battle, but it mattered. It was the first time in this campaign that Mamluk steel met Mongol riders in the open, the first time the men could test whether the stories about Mongol invincibility were armor or poison. The Mongol garrison fought hard, as Mongol garrisons did, but the Mamluks pushed them out. The victory did not mean the Mongols were weak. It meant the Mamluks were not breaking. It meant the fear that had carried Mongol letters on invisible wings could be answered by something concrete: a defeated garrison, captured horses, a proof that Mongol blood could be spilled and that Mongol riders could be chased. That proof mattered because the next obstacle was not Mongol cavalry. The next obstacle was politics. Between the Mamluk army and Kitbuka's position in Syria lay the territories held by the Crusader states, Frankish enclaves along the coast centered on Acre. These states had survived for generations by playing larger powers against each other, by selling access, by offering truces, by enduring. Now they faced a choice that was both immediate and existential. If the Crusader lords aligned openly with the Mongols, they might gain protection and a chance to expand. The Mongols had already worked with Christian allies in the region, and there were those among the Franks who believed a Mongol alliance could deliver Jerusalem. But aligning with the Mongols also meant tying their future to an empire that treated allies as tools, and that had no reason to tolerate independence once conquest was complete. If the Crusader lords opposed the Mongols alongside the Mamluks, they would be aiding a Muslim military state that had every reason to crush the Crusader enclaves once the Mongol threat was removed. Neutrality, in theory, was the safest. In practice, neutrality required a delicate form of courage, letting a large, disciplined army march past your gates while you watched from the walls, knowing you might need that army as a shield today and might be fighting it tomorrow. At Acre, negotiations were tense and transactional. The Mamluks wanted passage. The Franks wanted survival. The agreement that emerged was not trust, it was arithmetic. The Crusaders allowed the Mamluks to march north through or near their territory, and in return they avoided immediate destruction at the hands of an army that, for this moment, was not hunting them. It was a small scene in the larger drama, but it was a reminder of how the Mongol advance had warped the region. The old pattern, Crusader versus Muslim, city against city, had been interrupted by something larger. The Mongols had made enemies cooperate out of fear, at least for long enough to fight a common threat. North of Acre, the land changes. The coastal plain gives way to hills and valleys that can be read like a tactical map. In late summer, the fields can still hold green in sheltered places, and water can still be found. Springs, streams, low areas where life concentrates. Armies pay attention to those places the way thirsty men pay attention to cups. Ain Jalut was one of those places. The name referred to a spring, a source of water in a landscape where water shapes roots. The valley sits in the Jezreel region, bounded by rises and ridges. It is not a single narrow pass, but it is terrain that can funnel movement and hide men if the hiding is done well. Kitbuka moved south to meet the Mamluks. He was not ignorant of the risk. He knew his force was smaller than the armies Hulagu had once led. He knew the Mamluks were not a disorganized city militia, but a professional military caste. He also knew something else. Every time the Mongols had faced a new enemy, the first battle often decided the psychological war. If Kitbuka could win once, cleanly, brutally, Egypt would fold, the Crusader states would submit or ally. Syria would stay quiet. The Mongol position would hold until Hulagu returned with greater strength. For Kitbuka, Ain Jalut was not merely a battlefield, it was an audition for authority. On the morning of September 3rd, 1260, the armies gathered in and around the valley. Exact numbers are impossible to fix with certainty. Medieval chroniclers often inflate, minimize, or repeat figures for effect. What matters is proportion and posture. Kitbuka's force was substantial but not overwhelming. Kutus and Baybars had brought a large army north, and they had chosen ground that allowed them to use it. Baybars took the forward role. He was the kind of commander who understood that battles are often decided before the first full collision, decided by where the enemy believes the battle is happening and where the enemy believes the enemy is. The initial engagement unfolded in a way that would have looked familiar to Mongol veterans: cavalry skirmishing, archers probing, riders testing response. Baybars's forces pressed, then pulled back, then pressed again. To Mongol eyes, it could look like a faltering line, the first tremor of an enemy about to be broken. Mongol commanders had spent decades learning how to turn that tremor into a stampede. Kitbuka committed to the pursuit. Mongol cavalry surged forward with the confidence of a force that expects the world to behave the way it usually behaves. Horses thundered into the valley. Archers sent arrows into the retreating Mamluks. The pressure built the way Mongols liked it: forward motion, enemy movement, the sense that the enemy is losing control. Then the ground began to reveal its own plan. From the flanks and the rises, Mamluk forces that had been concealed moved into position. The valley that had seemed like open space began to feel like a trap with closing walls. Baybars's retreat was not collapse, it was lure. The Mongols, who had written the textbook of feigned retreat, found themselves reading their own language in an unfamiliar hand. Kitbuka did not retreat immediately. Stubbornness was part of his strength. He fought to break through. Mongol discipline held under pressure, and for a time the battle was not a clean reversal, but a grinding, violent struggle in which the Mamluks had to prove that their plan could survive the shock of Mongol aggression. This is where the Mamluk state's nature mattered. The Mamluks were not merely trying to win a battle, they were trying to keep cohesion while being hit by the most feared cavalry in the world. Individual bravery mattered, but formation mattered more. Units had to hold, commands had to be obeyed. A single panic could unravel the entire trap. At a critical moment, Kutuz committed more of his force. Later chroniclers would remember Kutuz as personally rallying the men, even exposing himself in the fighting, an image of leadership that may carry some embellishment, but reflects the kind of decision that had to be made. A commander in that moment either holds something back out of caution or throws it in to decide the day. Kutuz chose decision. Pressure turned into encirclement. Mongol riders found their lines disrupted. Horses that had carried invincibility now carried exhaustion and confusion. The Mongol attempt to punch out became a desperate contest of space, to regain open ground, to restore the ability to maneuver, to keep the battle from turning into a slaughter. And then something rare happened. The Mongols broke. Not in the sense that every man fled, not in the sense that the force ceased to exist, but in the sense that the Mongol momentum, the thing that had made other armies fold, was stopped, turned, and driven backward. The psychological advantage shifted in real time. Mamluk riders pursued with a ferocity that came from more than victory. It came from the knowledge of what defeat would have meant. Kitbuka fought on. He was captured rather than killed in the chaos, and he was executed afterward. The death of a commander is often a tidy narrative device in history, but on that day it was also a signal. This was not a skirmish at the edges of empire. This was a defeat that could not be explained away as weather or accident. A Mongol field commander had been beaten and killed by a regional power that refused submission. The field at Ain Jalut did not instantly change the wider world. News travels slowly. Armies move slowly. Politics moves at its own pace. But the meaning of the battle was immediate for those who understood the Mongols. Fear had been a weapon because fear had been rational. Ain Jalut made fear less rational. It introduced doubt into the Mongol myth, and doubt is contagious. The Mamluks pressed the advantage quickly. Syria, which had submitted partly out of fear and partly out of exhaustion, now had a new reality to consider. Cities that had opened their gates to Kitbuka could open them to Kutuz instead. Local leaders who had pledged obedience could pledge again with a different calculation. Damascus saw the Mamluks arrive as liberators and conquerors at the same time. The city did not become free. It changed masters. But in a region that had watched Baghdad's destruction and expected the same, changing masters could feel like salvation. Qutuz entered Syria with the authority of victory. Baybars rode with him, and every man around them understood that victory did not erase the politics of Cairo. It intensified it. The promises Qutuz had made before the march north now mattered in a way they had not in Cairo's audience hall. Rewards had to be distributed. Provinces had to be governed. Commanders who had taken risks expected compensation. Baybars, who had played a decisive role in the battle, expected more than praise. Qutuz also faced a problem that victory had not solved. The Mongols were not gone. Hulagu's withdrawal had reduced Mongol pressure, but it had not eliminated Mongol ambition. The Mongols still held territory farther east. They still had the ability to return. Syria could be lost again if Egypt treated the victory as an ending rather than a pause. So Qutuz did what practical leaders do after sudden success. He moved to consolidate. Garrisons were placed. Loyal emirs were positioned. The Mamluk state began to extend its military administrative system into the Levant, creating the beginnings of a frontier designed not for a single battle, but for sustained resistance. This consolidation was also a threat to men like Baybars. A stabilized, centralized Mamluk regime meant fewer chances for an ambitious commander to reshape the hierarchy. Baybars had fought the Mongols, but he had also fought his way up through the Mamluk system. He knew how quickly a promise could become a pretext, and how quickly a rival could become a liability. On the march back toward Egypt, the tension came to a head. Near Salihiyah, in the northeastern Nile Delta region, Qutuz was killed, assassinated by Mamluks who had followed Baybars. The killing was swift, the kind of political violence that the Mamluk system both condemned and produced. It was justified with grievances about rewards and promises. It was also, plainly, a seizure of power at a moment when the throne's authority had been magnified by victory. Baybars took the sultanate. If Ain Jalut had been the moment the Mongol myth cracked, the assassination of Qutuz was the reminder that the Mamluks were not a moral counterweight to Mongol brutality. They were a different kind of hard regime, forged in a different kind of violence. Their legitimacy rested not on bloodline but on strength, and strength could be taken by a man who had enough allies and enough nerve. Baybars's rise mattered beyond Cairo's palace politics because it shaped how Egypt would respond to the Mongols in the years ahead. Baybars was a soldier's sultan. He understood that the Mongols would return. He understood that Egypt could not rely on one perfect trap forever. The battle at Ain Jalut was a lesson, but lessons only matter if you build institutions around them. While Baybars secured his throne in Cairo, Hulagu learned what had happened in Palestine. For a conqueror who had just broken the Abbasid Caliphate, a defeat by Egypt's slave soldiers was an insult that demanded response. Hulagu's instinct was to return west with force and erase the insult the way the Mongols erased everything, by making an example. But the Mongol world had changed since the days of Genghis Khan's early conquests. The empire was no longer a single spear thrust. It was a set of rival houses, competing interests, and internal fractures. Hulagu's western realm, the Ilkhanate, was becoming its own political entity, tied to the greater Mongol imperial structure, but increasingly shaped by local realities. One of those realities was that Hulagu's enemies were not only in Cairo, they were also within the Mongol world. To the north, the Golden Horde under Berke Khan, another Mongol ruler, and notably a convert to Islam, viewed Hulagu's actions in the Middle East with hostility. The destruction of Baghdad and the killing of the Caliph had religious and political dimensions that mattered deeply. More concretely, The Mongol successor states competed over territory, trade routes, and prestige. Hulagu could not simply march all his forces back into Syria without worrying about what was happening on his northern flank. The result was that the Mongols, for the first time, were constrained not by an enemy's walls, but by their own empire's internal wars. A great retaliatory expedition against Egypt became harder to sustain when the Caucasus and the steppe behind it threatened to ignite. This internal Mongol conflict did not save the Mamluks by itself. Egypt still had to defend its frontier, still had to fight, still had to bleed. But it changed the strategic environment. The Mongols could no longer pour limitless force into the Levant while treating every other direction as secure. Ain Jalut had not only proven the Mongols could be beaten, it had arrived at a moment when the Mongols were less able to absorb a setback. Baybars exploited that reality like a man who understood time as a weapon. He fortified, he reorganized, he turned Syria into a buffer rather than a prize to be enjoyed. The Syrian cities became not just places to tax, but places to defend. Garrisons were set, supply routes were secured. The Mamluk state began to treat the frontier with the seriousness of a permanent condition. Baybars also did something else, something that looks cold but makes sense in the logic of survival. He moved against the Crusader states along the coast. The temporary arrangement that had allowed the Mamluk army to pass Acre was never going to become permanent friendship. For Baybars, Crusader castles were potential Mongol footholds, potential ports for enemies, potential distractions on a frontier that could not afford them. If Egypt was going to face the Mongols again, Baybars wanted as few unstable variables behind him as possible. So the years after Ain Jalut were not a peaceful aftermath. They were a grinding consolidation of power, a tightening of control, and a reshaping of the region's balance. In the north, the Mongols still dreamed of returning. In the south, Baybars built a state that could endure their return. The Mongols did return repeatedly in different forms and under different leaders. The Ilkhanate in Persia remained powerful and wealthy. Mongol armies would raid into Syria again. They would win battles and lose them. They would threaten Damascus more than once. But the spell of inevitability had been broken, and broken spells are hard to repair. A Mongol commander entering the Levant after 1260 was no longer moving through a world that automatically submitted. He was moving through a world that had a precedent for resistance. For the people living in Syria and Palestine, that precedent meant something tangible. It meant that a city faced with Mongol envoys could look to Ain Jalut and decide that submission was not the only rational choice. It meant that a governor deciding whether to defect could weigh not only terror, but possibility. It meant that the Mongols, who had once used fear as an economy of force, now had to spend more actual force to get the same political result. Ain Jalut also changed the narrative architecture of the region. Before, the Mongols had been described as a force of divine punishment, a scourge, an apocalypse. After, they could still be described that way, but the description had a new clause attached. Apocalypses can be delayed, redirected, and sometimes defeated. This mattered deeply for the Mamluks' own legitimacy. The Mamluk regime had always needed justification beyond brute power. It could not claim ancient lineage. It could not claim prophetic descent. What it could claim was function. It could claim that it protected the land, defended the faith, kept the roads open, kept the frontier intact. Ain Jalut became a cornerstone of that claim. Baybars understood the value of that story. He cultivated it. He presented himself not simply as a successful coup-maker, but as a defender against the greatest external threat of the age. He built monuments, sponsored scholars, and wrapped the Mamluk state in the language of protection and order. The warrior regime became, in its own eyes and in many of its subjects' eyes, the wall that the Mongols had not been able to break. The irony, and one of the reasons Ain Jalut is such a tight story, is that the battle's outcome was not predetermined by moral virtue. It was determined by timing, intelligence, terrain, and institutional character. The Mongols had reached the Levant at a moment when their main force was drawn away by succession politics. The Ilkhanate's position in Syria depended on a forward commander holding ground with fewer troops than he would have preferred. Kitbuka's confidence was rational. It was based on decades of Mongol success. But confidence is not a substitute for mass when the enemy has chosen the battlefield and prepared the trap. The Mamluks, meanwhile, were uniquely prepared to exploit that moment. They were a military caste that trained relentlessly, fought constantly, and governed through force, because force was the only thing their system reliably produced. They were not romantic defenders of a golden age. They were hard men in a hard system, making hard calculations. Kutuz's execution of the envoys forced the army to fight by cutting off alternatives. Baybars's tactical skill shaped the battle's choreography. The discipline of the Mamluk units allowed the trap to work under pressure, and the political ruthlessness that killed Kutuz ensured that the state's response afterward would be led by a man, Baybars, who treated defense as an ongoing project rather than a single heroic episode. If Ain Jalut had failed, if Baybars's feigned retreat had become a real collapse, if the hidden units had panicked, if Kutuz had hesitated, the Mongols would likely have rolled down into the south with the weight of victory behind them. Cairo would have faced a siege, and Egypt's crowded Nile corridor would have become a landscape of desperation. The Mongols might have reached the Red Sea. The trade networks that fed Egypt's wealth might have been redirected or broken. The political center of the region could have shifted in ways that are hard to imagine because the world that followed did not happen. Instead, what happened was something both simpler and more profound. In a valley in Palestine, a professional army met the Mongols without flinching, used the Mongols' own tactical language against them, and held together long enough for the trap to close. Ain Jalut did not end Mongol power. The Mongol world would continue to shape Eurasia for generations. The Ilkhanate would remain a formidable state. Mongol rulers would adapt, negotiate, and eventually, in the Middle East, convert and blend into the societies they had once crushed. But Ain Jalut ended the feeling of helplessness that had preceded it. It ended the sense that history had become a one-way road with Mongol riders at the front and everyone else running behind. Centuries later, the valley still holds its spring. The hills still fold around it. The place does not look like the center of the world. Yet for a brief time in 1260 it was exactly that, the point at which the direction of fear changed, and an empire that had been treated like a force of nature was, at last, treated like an opponent.